Hello and welcome back. This is the week 1 lecture for English 203. So let's jump right in. I've already given you an introduction. So let's get started on chapter 1 of our textbook. And again, our book, I think I forgot to actually tell you the title in my introduction, but hopefully you already know it. A Handbook of Critical Approaches to Literature, the 6th edition. Make sure you get the right edition because they have changed a bit. So you see all the editors' names listed here on the cover. I ordered this book through the GBC bookstore, but of course you can go through Amazon or just get it yourself however you want online. And I forgot to mention earlier, there is an electronic version available. So it does not matter to me. You can get the electronic version, or like me, you can order a used version online, and maybe also like me, you will fail to get the sticker off, which will bother me all semester long. All right, so chapter 1 is all about pre-critical approaches to literature. So I mentioned these kind of briefly in my introduction. I often call these terms or concepts literary elements. I think of them as sort of the most foundational elements or building blocks of most literary texts. And they've kind of been around as long as literature's been around. These are, in some ways, these are, common concepts. They're sort of like, they create a vocabulary, really, for readers, critics, and scholars to be able to discuss the texts that they read. So like I said, these are familiar terms to most of us. I teach them in 101. A lot of middle school and high school teachers teach them. But I want us to kind of take a look at these terms with fresh eyes here in 203. Again, they're familiar and that's good, but one thing that we're going to do a little bit here in week 1 is complicate some of these terms, some of these concepts, because at lower levels of school, they're often treated somewhat simplistically, and that makes sense, right? But we're older now, and we're smarter, so we can do more with these terms. So one quick thing that I wanted to cover, they talk about it in chapter 1 of the book. You might find it somewhat interesting to reflect on the fact that the study of literature is a relatively recent thing in the U.S., at least the study of British or American literature is a relatively recent development. So as they point out, for a long time, well into the 19th century, the only type of literature that was really taught at the college level would have been the literature of antiquity, like ancient Greek and ancient Roman stuff, and many of us are familiar with some of these works, the works of Virgil or Aeschylus or Virgil, did I say that's Homer, Virgil? Yeah, Homer's the Greek one, Virgil's the Roman one. So epic poems, some of the works of these kind of ancient masters would have been studied at the college level. It would have been deemed important enough for study at that level. But more recent literary productions from the English-speaking world, like I said, British lit or sort of early examples of American literature were not really taught in college classrooms in the 19th century, at least not very often. So the sort of systematic institutional study of American literature really did not become sort of ingrained in our college culture until the 20th century. And we didn't really start having programs graduate programs that specialized in American literature until maybe, at least we didn't have many of them until around the middle of the 20th century. So again, maybe not terribly interesting to you, but why this matters to us is just as a reminder that the discipline of literary studies and the discipline of literary criticism are both kind of recent things. They've been created relatively recently, and that's kind of all the more reason to value some of these pre-critical approaches that we're looking at here in week 1, because they've been around for a long time, and for a long time they were sort of the only show in town. But as literature, as what we now think of as older literature, but was then more contemporary, as 19th century and 20th century literature produced in America became something to study in American colleges and universities, we needed sort of a critical discipline. We needed various critical mechanisms and procedures to help us do the kind of rigorous work that we needed to do with these literary texts. So in some cases, we're kind of lifting some long existing strategies and methods from previous eras. And some English scholars will claim that biblical exegesis performed by, medieval monks was kind of the forerunner of what we now think of as literary criticism or literary analysis. There's some truth to that. Of course, many of us don't really regard the Bible as a work of literature, so that gets a little messy. But yeah, some of these strategies, methods, techniques for sort of explicating texts, they've been around for a long time, and a lot of them go back to these central literary elements, or these sort of pre-critical approaches that we're going to be covering here in week one. So this stuff is not simply old stuff that we're sort of learning about as if they were, ancient relics. We can still use these pre-critical approaches. We can combine the pre-critical with more recent critical schools or strategies or approaches. We can combine. It's not a mutually exclusive thing. We don't have to choose between old and new. And similarly, one thing that we can sort of think about as we get started this semester, one of our sort of journeys, one of our processes that I want us to undergo is moving from what we call sort of emotional gut level responses to literature. I want us to move from that place, which is a place we already inhabit. All readers arrive at emotional responses to what they read. You don't need me or any instructor or any textbook to help you do that. But in this class, we're going to move from those early emotional responses into more, critical, more careful, more in-depth, more precise and nuanced, more informed responses. And to do that, we're going to use the tools that we learn. But some of these early tools might still kind of help us tap into those early emotional gut level responses. And I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with those. There's nothing wrong with the emotional gut level reaction to a text. And they talk about this a little bit in chapter 1. On page 1, they even mention that some literary critics, some people who work in this field, are sympathetic to the common complaint made by students, and maybe we've made this complaint or heard it made. Many students don't really care for literary criticism, or really just the entire critical, sort of analytical, evaluative apparatus that we use in literary study, consisting of all these things that we're going to be learning about throughout the semester. A lot of students reject all of it, because to them, the criticism, the critical approaches, they take away the fun from reading. They take away the joy of reading. They take away the pleasure aspect of the activity. And I can relate and I can sympathize, and Susan Sontag can also sympathize, as we see in chapter 1. There is some truth to the statement that too heavy an emphasis on critical approaches can sometimes distract us or pull us away from the actual work of art that we are analyzing. So if we get too caught up in our critical approaches, we might lose sight of the beauty of the prose that we're reading. We might lose sight of the artistry of the novel or the poem or the short story that we're looking at. So that is a real risk that I think we need to guard against. But my overall attitude towards criticism is like my attitude towards most other things. All things are mostly fine in moderation. So I want us to try to strike a balance between our initial gut level reactions, which are very much based on our own personalities, our own perceptions, our own beliefs, our own knowledge. And again, you don't need any help from me or anyone else when it comes to arriving at those emotional gut level reactions. And they're good and they're valid, and a lot of times we come up with a lot of good ideas in those early stages. But we can also turn to a more critical stage, and we can develop some more ideas, some more interpretations, and we can dig a little deeper using some of these approaches. So if we strike a balance between the emotional and the critical, I think we'll be able to avoid some of these problems that students often talk about. And again, we've probably experienced this in classroom settings before. There can be real anxiety sometimes, real fear felt by students when it comes time to interpret or analyze texts. There's a lot of fear about whether or not we get it. Do we understand the text properly? I just want to say, before we jump into the pre-critical elements, I just want to sort of caution you against that, that way of thinking, that mindset. I think that's really negative, and I think it holds students back. I don't want you guys to think so much about right and wrong, right? This is English, this is literature, this is not math, this is not a hard science class. So we don't deal in absolutes necessarily. We don't always deal with correct answers and incorrect answers, although those do exist in English. Both of those exist. But more important for us, more important than thinking about right or wrong, I want us to think about good, better, and bad readings. I want us to think about readings, not right or wrong answers. The kind of work that we're doing in here is often given the sort of shorthand of reading. We are developing our own readings of these texts using various tools and strategies and methods. So I give you the tools, you guys will develop your own readings using those tools. And our goal, of course, is to produce good readings, interesting readings, original readings, full of original interpretations and in-depth, compelling analysis. But the great thing about analyzing literature is there's really no limit to the number of good readings that we can come up with, because we're all going to read texts a little bit differently. And that's why it's dangerous to get caught up with right and wrong. If everyone in this class reads the same novel, we're all, and we all understand the plot, we all understand what the book's about, we're still going to arrive at different conclusions. We're all going to interpret that book a little bit differently. And the approach that I use to conduct my reading, to conduct my analysis, will very likely be different than the approach my neighbor, my classmate uses. So we're going to arrive at different findings. We're going to make different claims. We're going to be doing different things. But it doesn't mean that I'm wrong and she's right, or vice versa. It means that we've arrived at two different readings, and they can both be valid. Now, some readings are better than others. We want to strive for as high a level as we can achieve, and there are such things as bad readings. But the only thing you have to avoid is coming up with a reading that is not supported or substantiated by anything in the text. So as long as you can point to reasons for your claims, as long as you can show us evidence for your positions, as long as you can use these critical approaches in productive ways, you're going to come up with good readings, even if your classmates might have read the book very differently than you did. So let's not think about right and wrong. Let's just think about coming up with good original readings. So let's jump into the pre-critical, or sort of literary elements, as I often call them. Again, I teach these in 101. So I'm assuming a lot of us are somewhat familiar with them. And these are sort of basic elements that all texts contain. Virtually all literary texts will have at least some of these things. But before we get into them, let me just say a quick thing about the word text. Okay, a quick disclaimer or sort of a warning. I will use this word text, T-E-X-T. I will use this word in a very broad, sort of capacious manner. So when we say text, we can refer to a lot of different things. Obviously, first and foremost, we can refer to literary texts. That means novels, short stories, poems, and plays. But we can also leave the realm of literature. The great thing about the term text is it can apply to really almost any work of art. It can refer to a lot of different artistic mediums, because a lot of these different types of art are still narratives in various ways, and they still contain a lot of these same elements that we find in literature. So, for example, I will sometimes refer to movies as texts. Sometimes I will refer to TV shows as texts. Perhaps songs could be text. Perhaps opera or ballet performances could stand as text. Basically, for us, for our purposes, a text is any work of art from which you can extract meaning. If you can find a meaning to that work of art, chances are some of these elements are at play. So we can also use them for visual art, sort of traditional works of visual art like paintings or sculpture. So not all of these are traditional, straightforward narrative art, although many of them are. But even if they're not, we can still call them texts, and we can still locate a lot of these pre-critical elements at work in all of these different types of texts. So that's what I was talking about in my introduction with alternative media assignments. In those assignments, you'll have an opportunity to leave literature, go to these other literary, these other artistic mediums, apply some of these approaches to movies or music or TV shows or graphic novels or whatever you like. All right, so we'll talk more about that later. So just so you know what I mean when I say text, it is a very broad term for us. Okay, so let's jump into the basic pre-critical elements that they cover in Chapter 1. I just sort of want to drive home some things and make sure we're clear on everything. So, you need to write these down. You need to write definitions down for all of these terms. I believe we have 7. Yeah. So Chapter 1 gives us 7 pre-critical approaches that I'm going to expect you guys to remember and use throughout the semester. So I'm not going to ask you to memorize a lot in this class, but I would like you to get very familiar, very comfortable with these. You don't have to recite them from memory, but they should be in your notes, and you should be able to use them at the appropriate times throughout the semester. So let's start with setting. I just want to move through them in the order that they appear in the book. But again, we have to use these things when we're conducting any kind of literary analysis. We're going to be adding to our tool belts as we go, but these are very essential tools. So let's start with setting. You guys already know what most of these mean, so I will not belabor the point, but I do want to add something in regard to setting, one thing that the book does not mention. But obviously, when we're talking about setting, you know that we're asking where and when the events of a story take place. So again, we're often thinking about setting in narrative terms, but even if we're looking at a work of art that isn't necessarily telling a story, there's still some type of setting. There is still a location, a scene of the action. But one thing that I will point out that the book doesn't point out that I think is important is the fact that there are 2 levels of setting. So in the book, they really only discuss physical setting, or what we might call sort of geographical or physical location. So where is somebody located? What country? What state? What city? What town? Maybe in somebody's house. Those are the kind of details we would think about with physical setting. And of course, it's very important, but also let's think about what we might call temporal setting. Let's think a little bit about time. What time period are we in? Are we in the present? Are we in the future? Or perhaps we are in the past. So there really are two levels of setting. We can think about physical setting and we can think about temporal, or you might think about it as geographical and historical setting. So important to consider. Also, let's talk a little bit about plot. Again, we already know what the plot is. It simply refers to the sequence of events in a narrative. So these events could be life-changing, they could be earth-shattering, they might also be very mundane, depending on what type of story we're dealing with. Typically, the plot will feature some kind of conflict, things will happen. If you look on page 7, you'll see Freytag's pyramid, which is supposed to kind of give us, or his triangle, whatever they call it. They're supposed to kind of give us a general sense of all the key elements that are included. It is a pyramid. All the key aspects or elements that are included in a typical plot. So some people don't really like what Freytag has done here. Some people think it's overly simplistic, and they'll claim, well, not all plots conform to all of those things, which is true. I will comment on that in a moment. But just be familiar with all the terms that you see in the pyramid. So starting with exposition. That's the background information that is usually provided to readers or viewers at the beginning of a narrative. So this will often be important information involving setting. We might be introduced to characters. We might be given some inkling of theme or at least subject matter. We're usually placed in a location. We usually meet people at this stage. This is important background information that readers or viewers need to know. So typically we'll get exposition at the beginning, followed by rising action. This is very broad and kind of vague. Rising action could be virtually anything, but tension builds, events transpire, conflict might develop, and then at some point we're going to hit the climax, which you see is the peak of the action. That's going to be the shootout, the big confrontation, the big reveal. Usually it's a moment of high tension. It's the peak of the action. It's usually a very important thing within, whatever world we're in, again, based on the subject matter. And then we're going to have falling action, which doesn't have to be a lengthy period. I know in the pyramid it looks like the falling action takes as much time as the rising action, but that's not necessarily true. This is just going to be sort of the tying up of loose ends. Things are getting resolved, and then we have the conclusion, or the denouement, at the end. So the objection to Freytag's pyramid is, like I said, some people claim that, well, you're not always going to find all of those elements at work in a plot, and that's true. And I think we can probably observe that through our own viewing. Some films or books don't really provide exposition. They just drop us into the action without much background information at all. In some cases, we might not feel like there's very much falling action. We might not even feel like some stories contain a climax. There's really no rule that you have to have one. I know I've encountered stories in both movie, TV, and book form that didn't really have conclusions. They felt like they ended very abruptly, perhaps right after the climax or perhaps during the falling action. So sure, people do all kinds of interesting things with plot, and some directors or writers might lop off certain parts of Freytag's pyramid. They might not have exposition, they might not have a conclusion, they might not have a recognizable climax, or they might not have much falling action. But typically, we're going to find at least some of these things at work, and we can think of the pyramid as sort of the platonic ideal of what a plot could be. These are all the things that a plot could include if you're sort of going for a deluxe model. So remember, not all plots contain all of those things, but those are good things to look for and be aware of, because you're going to find at least some of them in virtually everything that you watch or read. Now, character is the next pre-critical approach. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this. We already know who characters are. They are the people that inhabit these works of art, these stories. I'll just say the book kind of already talks a little bit about protagonists and antagonists. Just remember, protagonists do not have to be heroes. They are simply main characters. So they are the characters through which the viewers perceive the action. We as viewers or readers are often asked to identify with protagonists. And that can be problematic at times because, again, not all protagonists are heroic or even likable or reliable. So sometimes we are trapped with psychopaths or untrustworthy people. So again, don't think of protagonists as always being heroes. Of course, sometimes they are, but not always. And in a similar way, antagonists are not always villains. The antagonist is simply the character or a character who is opposing the protagonist in some way. The antagonist is standing between the protagonist and the things that the protagonist wants. That's kind of how to look at it. So again, the antagonist doesn't have to be a villain. The antagonist simply is operating at cross purposes with the protagonist. They are opposing one another for whatever reason. There can be lots of interesting reasons for that conflict, which will often be the central conflict at work in the plot. So oftentimes with plot, we just need to follow it, but we also need to be aware of what's there and what's not. And it's kind of a similar thing with characters. We just need to be aware of them. We need to keep track of them, and we need to form opinions about them based on the information that we're given. And one thing the book sort of encourages you to remember is that characters in a lot of sort of sophisticated, complex works of art, characters are weird and ambiguous, just like people, right? A lot of people in real life are unpredictable. They do things sometimes that you don't think they'll do. And as we know, most people are complicated. Right? People have a lot of different sides to their personality. Most people are capable of doing really great things and also doing pretty bad things. So if that's true of people, it's often going to be true of characters. But of course, this depends on what genre we're looking at and a lot of other factors. If it's a realistic style, we're probably expecting our characters to seem like real people. If it's some kind of more surrealistic or fantasy-based style, we might not see characters that strike us as realistic in the same ways, but we'll be able to relate to them on some level. There'll be some relatability, some resonance in successful characters, even if they bear no resemblance to anyone we've ever seen or met. So, yeah, just be attentive when you're looking at characters and be aware of and appreciate their ambiguity. We can't always boil characters down to really simple, he's a good guy, he's a bad guy, I'm with him, I'm against her, right? Sometimes it is more complicated than that. Next, they talk about structure. So I want to be clear on what we mean here. Depending on what type of novel, short story, movie, show we're looking at, we're going to be talking about different things when we talk about structure. Oftentimes we just refer to the plot structure or the sequence that's sort of being used to arrange the events of the plot. But it can also refer to certain literary formulas or genres that might have certain structures as well. So think about it like this. If we're analyzing a horror film, for example, we can think a lot about plot structure because a lot of horror films follow similar plot structures. They have similar beats, similar types of climaxes, similar types of rising and falling action, and maybe even similar conclusions. We can also think about characters. because a lot of horror films use similar types of characters. We might think of them as sort of stock types, prototypes that often show up in that particular genre. So if we're looking at horror films, we're thinking about plot structure and character type. We're going to find a lot of patterns and formulas and structures at work within those things. But we can also go in a different direction. So if we're analyzing a sonnet, we might be thinking about meter or the arrangement of stanzas. Those also pertain to structure. We might be thinking about rhyme scheme or any number of other things. So structure will vary based on what we're looking at. Is it a poem? Is it prose fiction? Is it a movie or a TV show? But oftentimes we're thinking about the structure of the text itself or the structure of the plot. But we can also think about some of these other elements like character, maybe even like setting, when we think about structures that we can sort of track and break down and kind of reassemble. Because again, there's underlying structures that we're familiar with, particularly with genres of movies that we like, types of shows, or types of literature. There's lots of repeating, recurring structures, and the more comfortable we get with those, the more work we can do as critics and scholars. So then they move on to style, which I think is kind of one of those very tough to define, but I know it if I see it kind of concepts, right? Any filmmaker that you like, any TV showrunner who makes shows on TV that you like, any writer that you like, they all have their own unique styles. And styles, of course, can vary widely, just like types of people can vary widely. So some styles we might think of as super realistic. Others might be kind of, flights of fancy. Some might be over the top, melodramatic, over the top with violence and melodrama. Some others might be witty and playful. Again, it can sometimes be difficult to describe style. So when appropriate, I'll offer some, genre headings and some kind of general categories that we can use when talking about style. But sometimes we just have to describe what we're seeing as best we can. Because again, any filmmaker or writer who we really know and like has a discernible, unique style that we can probably describe, break down, and analyze, and arrive at some original conclusions about it. So I would recommend that you look over on page 10 just for kind of a flavor, just to get a flavor of what I'm talking about. They mention the styles of Johnny Depp, Shakespeare, Hemingway, Alice Walker, Kurt Vonnegut, right? So everybody has their own style. Just by looking at some of those examples, you can kind of get a feel for what I mean by that. Next, we have atmosphere. Another thing that we kind of see it, we recognize it, but it can sometimes be difficult to discuss it. So the atmosphere just refers to the mood or the feeling that sort of permeates an environment. So the book, I think, uses an example of sort of gothic horror. We might find a haunted castle. We might have a rainy night. That helps to create atmosphere. That helps to create mood. That gives cues. Those types of settings, those types of details give cues to the readers and the viewers. It helps us to understand how we should feel and how we should be reacting to the texts. So many different aspects can contribute to atmosphere. Setting can contribute. The plot can contribute. Diction or word choice. And that's true in visual mediums like movies. It's also obviously true with written texts, with literature. The tone is often very important, the tone of an author. We can also think of movies or shows as having tones, satirical tones, earnest tones. There are different registers that people can be operating and speaking in. And also, if we're thinking about some non-literary texts like movies or shows, we can certainly think about music. We can think about costumes. We can think about sets, sets in a film or a show and how they can all contribute to atmosphere as well. And then finally, theme. We'll end here. This is a big one. You got to make sure you understand this term and use it correctly. The theme refers to the overall meaning of a text. So we're talking about sort of the underlying idea. I think of it almost as the overall message that the text is trying to get across. So remember I said earlier, a text is anything that we can extract meaning from. Well, often that meaning will come out in the form of one or more central or key themes. So it's important to remember the theme is not the same as the plot. Okay? The theme is not the same as subject matter. So the plot is what happens. The plot, as we've already said, refers to the events that are taking place in the story. The subject matter is simply what it's about. It's a war movie, right? It's, you know, the subject matter is the Vietnam War, and the plot follows this ragtag bunch from basic training until some big battle, right? Those aren't the same as theme. Okay, theme is the message. Theme is the meaning. And as critics, as scholars, or just as advanced students, it's our job to extract that theme and to make sense of it and to do some work with it. And in some cases, we'll find that some texts have multiple themes, not just one. But we have to find some of that meaning and then do something with it. That's sort of our ultimate goal here. So what does the text say? You guys need to think about text as being active. They do things in the world. So if we think about text as saying things, delivering messages, delivering meaning, we need to be able to interpret what they're saying, what they're doing, and we need to be able to explain why it all matters. So hopefully that all makes sense. What I want you to look at near the end of chapter 1, starting on page 13, I want you to take a look at that famous painting, Las Meninas, by Velázquez. What they're doing, and you're going to see this painting a lot throughout the book, what they're doing is they're going to run that painting through all of those pre-critical approaches that I just described. And they're going to use each one of those approaches to basically interpret the painting, arrive at some conclusions, make some original points about the painting. So each one of those pre-critical approaches can serve as a sort of unique lens, as an entry point to help us analyze various texts. And in this case, we're thinking of this painting as a text. So you can take a look from page 13 to 16, see how they run through each one of those approaches to arrive at some original ideas about that famous Spanish painting. And we're going to be doing something similar to that for our first alternative media assignment. So this will be a good way to get ready for that task. So if you have any questions, if you need any clarification on chapter 1, let me know. Again, read the chapter if you haven't already. I just provided sort of a gloss. Make sure you're doing all the reading each week. I try to keep it reasonable. Most of these chapters are pretty manageable. And like I said last time, for some of the longer ones, we're actually breaking them up and covering them over the course of 2 weeks. But try to get through chapter 1 this week, because in week 2, we move on to chapter 2. So let me know if you have questions, and if not, I will see you next time.